Hello, and welcome to today's episode of The Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark Seven, and today I want to present the first episode in a series covering various topics relating to the United States Armed Forces between the World Wars. This episode will give a general survey of the state of the Army's air units. There was hardly any call on U.S. Army aviation in the 2 decades between the wars, and therefore I think the story of this branch of the services shows clearly how domestic economic and political factors influence military policy in the absence of a pressure of an outside threat, and how policy towards the military can therefore exert an influence on the rate and scope of technological and industrial change. United States naval aviation will not be discussed in this episode, but will be treated in a future one. For this episode, I'll be relying on 2 sources for my information. First is the Comprehensive Aviation in the U.S. Army, 1919-1939, by Marr. This is an official account published by the Air Force Historical Research Center. The other, on which I rely for details about the aircraft themselves, is the very authoritative United States Military Aircraft since 1909 by Gordon Swanborough and Peter Bowers. So now, let's begin our story in the wake of the collapse of Germany and Europe, and of the armistice putting an end to the Great War. During the United States' relatively short participation in the First World War, the country's military air services expanded out of all proportion to their pre-war size. The United States Army Air Service, as it was called at this time, grew from a total of 1,200 personnel with a handful of miscellaneous airplanes in April 1917 to more than 190,000 men flying thousands of battle-tested aircraft at the conclusion of the armistice 20 months later. As late as 1907, the Air Service, then known as the Aeronautical Division, had been a tiny part of the Signal Corps concerned mainly with operating tethered observation balloons. Considering that it did not receive its first heavier-than aircraft until 1909, the transformation over the course of the ensuing decade was truly dramatic. In the post-war situation, however, no need remained for the massive armaments produced by the victorious powers. Aircraft and air forces were no exception. By June of 1919, demobilization had cut the number of men in air service ranks to 27,000. Many flying units had been raised by the Americans and sent overseas, and the majority were sent back to the United States and disbanded there. Some of these aircraft and supplies which had equipped these units were sold or turned over to the Allies. In many cases, the planes were broken up, the valuable parts stripped out, and what was left over simply piled up and burned. A total of 2,000 aircraft were selected to be sent back to the U.S., along with another 1,000 aircraft engines. These were mostly British and French types, but they also included 600 American-built de Havilland DH-4s, as well as 300 aircraft captured as prizes from the Central Powers. Along with the remainder of the newly built planes still in the U.S., these would constitute the original stock of planes used by the post-war air service. These were many more planes than would be needed by the reduced post-war establishment, and this was a fact that would cause problems for American aircraft builders in the upcoming years. Of the flying units themselves, only 4 squadrons each of bombers and fighters, somewhat larger contingent of reconnaissance squadrons, and a small number of balloon companies were retained on the active list. After their arrival back in America, the fighters and bombers, along with 4 squadrons of reconnaissance machines, were formed into a wing and sent to Texas. Here they would spend much of 1919 flying patrols along the southern border in response to the disorders occurring in the adjacent parts of northern Mexico. Throughout much of the interwar period, this single wing based at Kelly Field would be the only one the Americans kept in service. The expansion program had resulted in the acquisition of a great deal of material. The disposal of all the surplus property, which included large amounts of real estate acquired for now unneeded installations, became a full-time occupation for many U.S. airmen. Many planes and engines were prepared for long-term storage and packed into facilities created for this purpose. The idea of selling aircraft and engines was pursued for a while, but ran into a number of problems. For one, the air service was not set up as a commercial enterprise, and when planes and engines were offered for sale to the general public, they quickly found themselves unable to handle the multitude of individual transactions involved. Also, many of the planes were not in the best condition, and the service wanted neither to spend the money needed to put them into shape or to assume the risk of selling unsafe aircraft to the public. A third, and ultimately more important reason, was that air service plane sales directly competed with the American aircraft industry. This had been created out of virtually nothing by the wartime building program, and now that the government wasn't buying, there was very little market for airplanes in the country. In order to protect the vulnerable plane makers more than anything else, the public sales were discontinued and planes and engines sold only to the aircraft industry itself. Similar concerns of public safety and protection for the aircraft industry were behind legislation enacted around this time prohibiting the importation of war surplus aircraft into the U.S. by foreign companies. These measures were taken in growing consciousness of the basic inseparability of the country's ability to field high-technology weapons such as aircraft, and the cultivation by public policy of the manufacturers of these weapons. The basic problem is that these companies cannot generally survive, much less conduct the experimentation and development needed to stay competitive with potential military rivals in a peacetime economy. That state support, either in the form of direct subsidies or an artificial market in the form of government purchasing, was necessary to enable these companies to stay in step with the current state of the art was becoming clearer and clearer. Without this support, the aircraft and other weapons producers could not afford to maintain the necessary plant or employ the necessary specialists. The invaluable skills of these men would also decay and become outdated without employment. The working relationship that was developing in this period between the armed forces and high-technology industry, which would later come to be referred to by some as the military-industrial complex, would come to be characteristic of the economies of all the great military powers. The problems of demobilization and liquidation of the wartime expansion were to occupy the air service for most of 1919. General Mason Patrick, who commanded the air service contingent sent to Europe, expressed his opinion that the process was getting in the way of establishing a basis for a rational peacetime operation of the air service. But the problem was a finite one, and pressing as it may have been for some time, it was soon dealt with. At this time, the air service was organized as a combatant arm of the Army. The legal basis of this arrangement was the President's wartime authority, and it had been established in its then current form by executive order. In the year following the armistice, Congress would take up the question of a more permanent arrangement for aviation organization in the U.S. services. A pair of bills would be put forward in 1920, providing for the creation of a cabinet-level Bureau of Aeronautics, which would control all government air activities, similar to the Ministry of Air that had recently come into being in England. In some versions of this idea, civil aviation would also be included under the authority of this agency. A board of air service officers headed by its then current director, General Menaher, met and recommended the creation of two agencies, one to handle aeronautical research and development, and the other to handle procurement itself. In the end, a bill was passed into law, the National Defense Act of 1920. It established none of the proposed agencies, but rather made the wartime arrangement permanent. The air service was to be kept at a peacetime strength of 27 squadrons, a couple dozen balloon companies, and a small number of airships. The service was confirmed as a combatant arm of the Army co-equal with others such as the artillery or the engineers, and given responsibility for the development of its own technical equipment. A wartime mobilization plan was produced to expand this force to over 200 squadrons, 100 balloon companies, and 24 airships. The major factor affecting the air service in the post-war years was the marked reluctance of the American Congress to appropriate money for military purposes. This was a particular difficulty for the air service. On America's entry into the war, Congress had passed the Aviation Act of 1917, which had authorized an expansion of the air service to a wartime strength of over 350 squadrons. At the time, the appropriation to make this a reality was the largest sum of money voted by Congress for any purpose whatsoever. This was $640 million in 1917 dollars. The expansion ran into industrial difficulties of many kinds and failed to meet its intended goals, and it came in for a great deal of criticism. Despite the flaws, the program did produce remarkable results in terms of aircraft production capacity and in terms of quantities of aircraft and engines actually produced. However, most of the period of American involvement in the war was spent in overcoming the difficulties encountered in the preliminary stages of the expansion, and production itself was only just hitting its stride when the war came to an end. The expected fleets of American aircraft had not appeared on the battlefield, and in fact only a comparatively modest force was actually engaged in combat. To many, then, the air service expansion, and the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on it, seemed to have had no effect on the war. Many in the country, consequently, were opposed to further heavy investment in the air services. Now that there was no one to fight, and since the idea of rapid expansion, in case need, seemed to at least have proven workable, they found little reason to maintain significant forces in peacetime. The image of newly built American planes given away in Europe or broken up and burned was another powerful weapon in the hands of opponents of air service funding in the coming years. In addition, the thousands of surplus aircraft and engines, the storage and disposal of which were still occupying the service for months after the war, indicated to many that they already had all they would need for years to come. Predictably then, air service funding dropped sharply right after the war. From a vote of $460 million in fiscal year 1919, it fell to $25 million in 1920, or a fraction over 5% of the previous year's total. Subsequent years would see little change. In 1923, funding fell to its lowest level yet, only $12.9 million out of a request of $26.2 million. Roughly the same amount, or a little less, was forthcoming for the next 2 fiscal years. This was considerably below the amount needed to maintain the established strength of the service, and many units were below strength and short of equipment. Money for maintenance was short, and many planes were in less than optimal condition. Some of this was due to easy access of large number of replacement planes and engines in storage, which increased the tendency to neglect upkeep. Throughout this period of limited funding, the worst effects of neglect were allowed to affect the units stationed in the home territory. The squadrons on the overseas stations, which were the Panama Canal Zone, the Philippine and Hawaiian Islands, were kept as close as possible to full strength. Some new aircraft were procured throughout this period, but they were very few in number. This was also a period of great stress for the American aircraft making industry. The greater part of wartime expansion capacity was liquidated by this time, and plane and engine makers survived on a shoestring budget provided by a very small military orders as well as whatever they could sell on the civilian market. This is not much. Since this is usually considered part of the golden age of aviation, this might be surprising to some. But in economic reality, very few people were buying planes in any quantity in the U.S. in the 1920s. The airline industry, probably the biggest customer, was in its infancy. Very few communities had airports, and the infrastructure of safe and reliable air travel was almost non-existent. A good proportion of those that did fly were operating converted World War I planes, which were noisy, uncomfortable, and unreliable. This made commercial flying something of a gamble, and less attractive to passengers, who were sometimes seated not in enclosed cabins but in exposed cockpits. Most of the significant progress in commercial aviation in this period was therefore accomplished using large flying boats, for which the lack of airports was no obstacle. Very few other buyers for aircraft existed. Many persons wishing to buy a plane for their own personal use had already purchased a World War I surplus aircraft, and though the U.S. mail would become an important early operator and purchaser of airplanes, it was also subject to government parsimony and funding. No solution to this difficulty would be found in the 1920s, and the U.S. aircraft industry as a whole would struggle on into the 1930s, when foreign armament programs would lead to large export orders and the expansion of American forces to a dependable domestic market. Despite the limitations imposed by financial stringency, U.S. airmen performed a great deal of the pioneering work in practical aviation during this time. A lot of this was accomplished as parts of exploits that featured a deliberate element of spectacle. Army flyers participated in air races, made and secured world records in things like altitude reached and time spent aloft, and made spectacular long-distance flights that received a great deal of media attention. Much of this had an element of public relations to it, and it was undoubtedly useful in the building of public support for air service funding. Furthermore, these attempts resulted in a lot of practical work that advanced the state of the art in flying. The more mundane activities of R&D also benefited from the experience and data gained as a result of these attempts to push ever further beyond the current limits. Improved flying controls, instruments, materials, and communication equipment were developed, as well as accessory items such as parachutes, which, with the exception of crews of tethered balloons, American airmen had hitherto not been issued. Attempts were made to produce specialized aids for night flying and navigation, and the understanding of meteorological phenomena hazardous to flying were encountered, such as icing, and countermeasures or means of avoidance were experimented with. As the need for accurate weather forecasts became more and more obvious, a start was also made on a national system of weather stations. The reports of prominent air service officers that the restrictions imposed upon their organization by the limited funding allowed it did not go unheeded. A pair of commissions were set up to look into the problem. These found that the reports of neglect were not exaggerated, and concluded that in its present state the air service would be unable to perform its mandated military duties if the need arose. Both recommended expansion and modernization programs, the first putting forth a 10-year plan and the latter a similar program lasting 5 years. These proposals were taken up by Congress, and on July 2, 1926, the Air Corps Act was passed into law. Aside from the changing of its name, this act did not change the relationship of the new Air Corps to the Army significantly, although it did include provision that it would have representation in the various planning councils of the War Department General Staff, thus ensuring that their point of view would receive attention. A few more general officers were also authorized for the service, but most importantly, the Act committed the government to a 5-year plan of expansion and set out yearly goals for aircraft procurement. Funding to implement this plan was authorized, and a figure of $31 million a year for the next 5 years was estimated to be required to carry it to completion. The largest item on this budget was the procurement of new planes, with over half of the appropriation in the first years going for this purpose. When it was officially constituted in 1926, U.S. Army Air Corps had 919 officers, 8,725 enlisted men, and 1,254 aircraft organized into 32 squadrons, most of which were under strength. The 5-year expansion plan envisioned an increase to 52 squadrons total. In terms of specific tactical types, the increases were from 8 to 21 squadrons of fighters, 8 to 12 squadrons of bombers, 2 to 4 squadrons of ground attack planes. The number of reconnaissance/Army cooperation squadrons would remain stable at 14. Of the 20 new squadrons, 10 would remain in the mainland, and 9 would be sent to the overseas stations of Hawaii, the Philippines, and the Canal Zone, while the last, a composite squadron made up of bombers, fighters, reconnaissance, and transport aircraft, would be assigned to the Alaskan Territory. The air forces retained in the U.S. would be organized into 2 bombardment wings, one on each coast, composed of 1 bomber and 1 fighter group, each group consisting of 3 squadrons. A 3rd fighter group was to be stationed near the center of the country, ready to respond to any direction. These units were intended to be used as an independent air force under the command of the Army General HQ, and not under the orders of any commander of the ground forces. An attack wing, made up of an attack group and a pursuit group, again each of 3 squadrons, was to be created and stationed in Texas, where it could watch the southern frontier. This was intended to be placed under the orders of a field army level ground commander. 9 of the observation squadrons were stationed around the country, and these were intended to be placed at the disposal of division and corps level ground force commanders. The expansion plan, modest though it was unable to reach its goal in the 5-year period stipulated. Delays meant that the program was unable to begin right away, and money troubles plagued the effort, not the least of which was caused by the coincidence of the beginning of the Great Depression with the early stages of the expansion. In terms of numbers, the plan fell short, and in 1932, when the plan was terminated, the force fielded a total of 50 squadrons, all of which were badly under strength. In terms of technology, the program had been somewhat more successful. Though the great majority of the force was flying biplane aircraft that were essentially upgraded World War I designs, crucial developments had occurred in the interim, and a new generation of much more capable aircraft was coming into or about to come into service. Throughout the late 20s and early 30s, the men of the Air Corps continued the pioneering work that they had begun after demobilization. Army flyers continued to fly in the big air races, and long-distance flights were carried out not only for record-setting purposes, but also for the mapping out of airways. These were regular routes marked out by lights and radio beacons, a network of which was coming into being at this time with Air Corps assistance. Another kind of first was achieved during the world record attempt for time aloft by the Army Fokker Trimortar transport dubbed the Question Mark. In 1929, this aircraft set a world record by spending an incredible 150 hours and 40 minutes in the air, or about 6¼ days. This was accomplished by a primitive in-flight fueling arrangement, which was used to fill the plane's tanks 37 times during the flight, with supplies for the crew being delivered in the air as well. The flight was terminated only due to a seizure of one of the aircraft's engines. This and similar work went far towards advancing the practical technique of flying. Tactical development was not neglected, and large-scale exercises and war games were carried out within the limits of the available funding, as well as competitions among units in skills such as gunnery and bombing accuracy. In February of 1934, the normal workings of the service were interrupted by its involvement in a national crisis involving the mail. The contracts given out to carry the nation's air mail were under congressional investigation for fraud and were in danger of suspension. The Air Corps was asked to step into the breach and prepare to carry the air mail until the situation could be resolved. The airmen tackled this task with zeal, but it turned out the Air Corps was not equipped or trained for this duty. Also, the flying of the mails is associated with the political imbroglio working itself out in Congress. The performance of the service in this role was under a good deal of scrutiny. The rash of accidents on the mail routes, resulting in the deaths of several airmen, provided a sobering reality check on the true state of Air Corps preparedness. After all, if they had difficulty simply flying the mail from place to place, how would they fare in combat against a modern adversary? The state of the Air Corps was once again put under congressional investigation, this time by a board headed by ex-Secretary of War Newton D. Baker. The Baker Board made broad and constructive recommendations for improvements in training and equipment, as well as pointing out that the Air Corps equipment and training were not really suitable to the task of flying the mails, and thus this was not a fair indicator of their wartime efficacy. However, the political will to improve the Air Corps did not result in the funding necessary for expansion. Much of this is due to the steeply rising cost of aircraft, as well as of military equipment in general throughout this period. The rapid progress of technology in the years after 1933 meant that the Air Corps would be progressively equipped with newer, more advanced, and more capable aircraft, but they would be procured in smaller numbers. After 1934, the Air Corps therefore shrinks in terms of numbers of airplanes, until the growing threat of war in Europe and the Pacific removed the reluctance of the American political class to appropriate the money necessary to expand the nation's air forces. Since that date, the expansion, and the much larger degree of funding, has not ended, and the Air Corps has grown rapidly into perhaps the most powerful military organization the world has ever seen. The speed with which this occurred, once the financial tap was opened, is the most convincing evidence that the critical factor in the growth and modernization of the U.S. air services in the period between the wars was the presence or absence of sufficient funding. The Americans had distilled the experience of the aerial fighting in the First World War into a small number of mission profiles. It based the organization of its air services and the design and procurement of its aircraft around these conceptions. These basic missions of military aviation were those of reconnaissance, bombardment, ground attack, and air-to-air fighting. This is reflected in the American organization based on observation, bombardment, attack, and pursuit formations, as these roles were termed. Each tactical role was used as a basis for specifications that were then issued to industry, leading to specialized development tracks not only for the aircraft themselves, but also of the tactical concepts employed and the doctrine guiding their implementations in action. Another organizing principle applied to the Army's aviation was the distinction between so-called air service and air force. It was partly to avoid confusion with the technical term air service that the U.S. Army Air Service was renamed the Air Corps in 1926. In technical usage, the term referred to missions performed as an integral part of a ground formation. A prime example of this use of air assets is one of the first uses of air assets, one that predates powered flight itself, spotting the fall of shot for artillery. Scouting, contact patrol, and other liaison missions also fall into the air service category. In some European countries, these functions were carried out by so-called Army cooperation units. Under air service doctrine, as laid out in the recommendations of the 1920 bill, these units were part of the organization of the ground formations they served, and under the orders of the commander of that formation. Air Force, on the other hand, referred to air units retained under the command of the Army's General Headquarters, or GHQ, and deployed in an independent capacity. These missions could be in support of operations on the ground, or they might be employed in a strategic campaign separate from the operations of the ground army. This GHQ Air Force, as it was called, will consist of pursuit, attack, strategic reconnaissance, and especially of heavy bombardment units. The distinction between these two ways of employing aircraft would continue to shape strategic and tactical policy throughout the period. A paradigm shift in aircraft design occurred during the early parts of the 1930s. This was driven ultimately by engine development, as more powerful and reliable engines enabled the creation of heavier, faster, higher-flying planes. The general track of engine evolution in this period moves from wartime designs, nearly all of which use the 435 horsepower V12 Liberty engine. This is a water-cooled design based on contemporary automobile engines. It was powerful for its time and was intended to power all of the American-built combat planes built for the wartime expansion program of whatever kind. Consequently, it was produced in huge numbers. It was used for most American designs in the immediately post-war years also, as they were cheap and available. Much of the experimentation and developmental work on aircraft engines at this time was also done on Liberties. This is one reason why aircraft of the 1920s and early 30s are usually powered by water-cooled engines with either an inline or a V arrangement. Contemporary aerodynamic thought also thought that the smaller cross-section of these engines allowed a more streamlined airframe than a plane using a radial engine, which must present a circular ring of cylinders to the airflow. This preference of water-cooled over air-cooled radial engines in the 1920s is due to this and a couple other reasons. Radial engines could only fit so many cylinders, usually about 9, around the circumference of the engine. To increase the number of cylinders, and thus the power of the engine, more must be added as the second row behind the first. This created cooling problems for the cylinders in the back row, which were masked from the oncoming airflow by the hot cylinders in the first row, and these problems were not mastered until the mid-1930s. Also, in addition to the larger cross-section presented to the airflow by the radial engine, this was in the form of a very irregular arrangement of machined cylinders with complicated, high surface area shapes that generated a disproportionate amount of drag, meaning that an aircraft powered by an inline engine could be expected to be faster than the same plane using a radial of the same horsepower. Once the problem of cooling a second row of cylinders on a radial engine was solved, their inherently smaller, simpler, and lighter design very quickly led to their replacement of water-cooled engines in the majority of American military planes. The higher drag of the radial engine proved to be outweighed by its increased power and better power-to-weight ratio, and the aerodynamic disadvantage was largely eliminated by the development of cowl rings that fared over the cylinders while allowing sufficient airflow for cooling. These were quickly developed into full cowlings, and the disadvantage of the larger cross-section became negligible. Another point in the radial's favor was that without an additional cooling system to expose to enemy fire, there was one less thing to go wrong. As a result, by the time of the Second World War, the radial engine was well on the way to replacing its water-cooled counterparts, with only models of outstanding performance, such as the British Rolls-Royce Merlin, remaining in widespread service. The increased power both allowed and necessitated changes in aircraft structural design, as the extremely draggy, externally braced biplane types experienced much greater stress on the airframe as speed increased. Heavier and more robust monoplane airframes built from light metals were thus made with sleek, streamlined contours. New construction techniques and materials allowed these planes to dispense with the network of struts and wires needed to brace the more fragile structures of the older planes. Superchargers allowed better performance at high altitude, and oxygen systems and enclosed cockpits made sustained operation here more endurable for the crew. Radio communications, both between planes and between planes and the ground, was becoming commonplace, greatly enhancing the usefulness and flexibility of air units. Constant speed and variable pitch air screws fabricated from light alloys replaced fixed pitch carved wooden propellers, and this allowed a much more efficient use of the increasing degree of power that was becoming available. The greater speed and weight of these planes created a need for flight control assistance, and hydraulically operated trim tabs and flap systems increased flight stability and low-speed performance. These same systems would eventually be adapted to actuate retracting landing gear systems, further enhancing aircraft range and performance. Many more individual advances can be cited from this era, developed both by the aircraft makers themselves or as the result of work in related fields. For example, the development of 100-octane gasoline by American chemical engineers in this period provided a very underappreciated advantage to Allied flyers in the conflict to come. Much useful work in the field of applied aerodynamics was carried out by the National Advisory Council for Aerodynamics, or the NACA. This government research agency, the organizational ancestor of NASA, undertook research in a variety of subjects related to the practical science of flying and made their results available for the use of the public. Many advances in aircraft design and performance owe much to the painstaking research carried out by this agency. One relatively well-known achievement of NACA engineers was the development of cowlings that overcame the drag disadvantage of radial engines mentioned before. The overall effect of all this work was, generally speaking, to transform the U.S. Air Service from a force equipped with improved World War I planes to one equipped with early World War II types. Before we turn to examine some of the more important aircraft used by the various tactical units in the years between the wars, I want to make a note about the designation systems used in this period. Before 1919, there was no official designation system for Army aircraft. Company or designers' designations were generally used. In 1919, a system was instituted which consisted of a letter code denoting the tactical role which the aircraft was meant to perform, followed by a number indicating the design's position in the sequence of designs intended for that role. This first system had dozens of rather narrow role designations. For example, there was NBS, or Night Bomber Short Range. There would also be an NBL, or Night Bomber Long Range. Similarly, engine type could be part of the designation, as in the case of PW, or Pursuit, with water-cooled engine. This was an unwieldy system, and the specificity indicated the thinking of the airmen of the time, which thought in terms of aircraft designed for narrow limits. This may have been a reaction to their early post-war experience when they found themselves flying war surplus DH-4s in almost every role, and therefore may be expected to have speculated on the advantages of specialization. What made this system hopelessly clumsy was the policy of assigning new series numbers for relatively minor changes of a single design. A new version of a service aircraft fitted with a new engine would be assigned an entirely different series number, although it was virtually the same aircraft. The fact that these were simply assigned in order meant that there was no obvious logical relation between the numbers assigned, and therefore situations such as that of the Curtiss Hawk biplane fighters could arise. These began as the PW-8, but this was changed to P-1. The P-1, P-3, P-5, P-6, and P-23 pursuit planes were all subsequent upgraded versions of the Hawk, varying little in appearance or capacity. Similarly, confusing multiplications of designations were present in various other aircraft series in U.S. service. After 1925, the system was simplified towards the one that was more familiar to students of World War II and after. This also used letter prefixes, but these were broader in application and much fewer in number. The major categories in this system were P for pursuit, B for bombardment, A for attack, O for observation, T for trainer, and C for transport. The practice of assigning new series numbers for upgraded models was also phased out and replaced by a letter suffix. Thus, hypothetically, the Curtiss Hawks mentioned above would have been designated P-1A, P-1B, P-1C, and so on in the newer scheme. This system was to continue with some minor changes until after the close of the Second World War. So, with this general picture in place, let's turn to the final part of this episode, which will be a brief survey of some of the more important aircraft used by the Air Service and the Air Corps. We'll consider each of the major tactical types of attack, observation, bombardment, and pursuit in turn. Attack aviation was the smallest of the tactical formations of the Interwar Air Corps. The American concept of the attack plane was that of an armored aircraft mounting a formidable gun armament, employed in low-level attacks in direct support of the ground troops. Though this most often meant strikes on battlefield targets like gun positions and armored vehicles actually in contact with friendly troops, it could also mean attacks on supporting installations behind the lines, such as airfields and supply depots, as well as transport targets like road convoys, locomotives, and watercraft. The attack planes were in any case intended to hit military targets in direct support of the ground army. When on active operations, attack plane units were placed under the tactical control of ground force commanders at the field army level. The approach to ground attack missions varied between the air forces of the major powers. The British, for example, tended to split this responsibility between light bombers and fighters. The Germans, of course, emphasized the dive-bombing attack, as did the Japanese and American navies. The Air Corps conception of ground attack was derived from the wartime experience of low-level trench strafing by fighter aircraft. American ground attack doctrine, then, came to emphasize low-level attacks with gunfire and small fragmentation bombs. Attack planes could also be fitted with chemical pods under the wings. These could be used for laying smoke screens or to dispense chemical weapons. It is worthwhile remembering that chemical warfare was expected and prepared for at this time. To see how the Americans planned to employ these kinds of weapons, you can watch the War Department training film number 27, which is available on YouTube, entitled Attack Aviation, Employment Against Hostile Aerodromes. In this training film, the method of attack on an airfield is illustrated, which includes flights of attack planes coming in over the target in line abreast formation at low level from various directions, strafing and dropping small parachute and phosphorus bombs and spraying toxic chemicals. The interwar period begins with American attack formations flying American-built copies of the British-designed de Havilland DH-4 and DH-4B. These were two-seater reconnaissance and light bomber aircraft which were also sometimes used in a fighter role. The American versions were dubbed, like so many other things in the U.S. at this time, Liberty planes. These differed from their European cousins mainly in the use of the ubiquitous Liberty V12 engine. The DH-4B was distinguished from the DH-4 by a revised placement of the fuel tank, a modification undertaken as a response to the plane's tendency to go over on its nose when performing certain ground maneuvers. The pilot and observer sat in open cockpits. When the plane was fitted for the attack role, both had a pair of .30 caliber machine guns, those in the front firing fixed ahead and those in the rear cockpit on a ring mount. The plane could also carry a few hundred pounds of bombs. The DH-4's performance was mediocre. Its controls and instrumentation were rudimentary. It topped out at speed at about 125 miles per hour and could climb at a relatively slow pace to a ceiling of just under 16,000 feet. Here, as elsewhere in the Army, the DH-4B was in use primarily because it was available, and this continued throughout the period of tight budgets as the Air Service burned through the war surplus planes and engines. An aircraft designed specifically for the ground attack role was in the works, and this machine indicates what American air tacticians were envisioning the future of attack aviation to be, based on the experience of the recent war. This aircraft was one of the first to enter U.S. service bearing the name of William Edward Boeing. This plane, called the GA-1, was intended to replace the DH-4 in attack aviation service. This aircraft has been described by one aviation historian as a, quote, bizarre contraption, and this is not inaccurate. This was an enormous 5-man triplane followed by 2 Liberty engines and a pusher arrangement. In terms of firepower, the thing was a real juggernaut. 2 gondola-type nacelles between the wings carried a gunner with a 37mm cannon, and the aircraft carried a battery of machine guns angled to fire downward as well. When the first of these aircraft arrived, it was quickly found to be sluggish and underpowered, with a long takeoff run and almost no ability to climb. Like many aircraft of the time, this gigantic, slow-moving target was an attempt to do too much with the technology on hand, and the project was not persevered with. The attack squadrons would continue to fly the DH-4 for some time to come. In the mid-1920s, they began to receive some new planes. These were the A-3s. These were conversions of the Curtiss O-1 Falcon observation aircraft. They were 2-seat biplanes, very similar in capability to the DH-4, but a little faster and incorporating some refinements, such as wheel brakes and horn-balanced elevator services. 76 A-3s would be built, including a few training machines with dual controls. The attack units would receive their first purpose-designed aircraft in mid-1932 when the Curtiss A-8 Shrike began to enter service. This was a big step forward. The Shrike was an all-metal 2-seater monoplane with a wing mounted low and a fixed, heavily spatted undercarriage. The A-8 was the initial version, powered by a Curtiss Conqueror 675 horsepower water-cooled inline engine. The succeeding version, the A-12, was fitted with a Pratt & Whitney Hornet radial engine putting out 625 horsepower. The radial engine installation, despite the somewhat lower power, was judged the more desirable. 10 A-8s and 42 A-12s were built. All carried a battery of 4 30-caliber machine guns mounted in the landing gear fairings and a flexible 30-caliber in the rear cockpit, as well as provision for an underwing bomb load of 4 100-pound or 10 30-pound bombs. 9 of the A-12s were still in service in Hawaii with the 26th Attack Squadron at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. After the Shrikes appeared, there arose a difference of opinion over whether attack planes should have 1 or 2 engines. This would result in 2 separate development tracks. The development of single-engine attack planes resulted in the Northrop A-17. This was a 2-seater, all-metal monoplane of much more modern design than the Shrike. Later models of this plane had retractable landing gear. It was powered by an 825 horsepower radial and carried a 4-gun battery of 30 caliber machine guns firing forward and a pair in the back cockpit. The A-17 had performance and armament and compared favorably with the fighters used by the Air Corps at this time. These were the standard attack plane in many units from 1936 to 1940. The twin-engine track began with the A-14 Shrike II, a slim, clean machine that looks very much ahead of its time but was not procured in large numbers. By 1937, this design trend had produced the Douglas Model 7A. This aircraft looks very similar to the B-25 Mitchell bomber, which was its contemporary. The degree of progress made in aviation in the 5 years since the appearance of the Shrike can be deduced by the performance of this plane. Top speed of just under 350 miles per hour and could fly twice as high or as far as any of the types we've been discussing so far. In terms of weaponry, the increase in capability was even more pronounced, as the gun armament had jumped to 7 30-caliber machine guns and more than a ton of bombs. The A-20 would replace the single-engine A-17s and would be the first American aircraft to be flown into action in the European theater by American crews in the Second World War. It would be produced in large numbers from 1937, when production to fill overseas orders commenced, to 1944, when full-scale war production was closed out. The superiority of the A-20 in the attack role ended the controversy over single or twin-engine attack planes in the U.S. Air Corps. This would prove irrelevant shortly after, as wartime experience would eliminate the separate attack arm in U.S. service, with the attack units redesignated light bomber squadrons and sharing their previous close support duties with the fighter bombers. A revival of pre-war style attack planes would reappear in the Vietnam era when turboprop technology made the single-engine, low-level close support plane viable again in the form of the A-1 Skyraider. But the true successors of these close support aircraft are the helicopter gunships that perform their duties in the modern armies of the world. Observation aviation in the U.S. Army existed primarily in the form of squadrons attached to division or corps-level ground units. Though trained, supplied, and administered by the Air Corps, in field operations, observation units were at the disposal of the commander of the ground unit they were supporting. The mission of observation units was scouting and artillery spotting, as well as contact patrol and liaison duty. Like the attack squadrons mentioned above, the observation units began the interwar period flying the DH-4. The Americans operated a large number of types of observation aircraft during this period. Many were simply militarized civilian light planes. In some cases, particularly among those units stationed in the overseas areas, flying boats were assigned to these units, and these observation amphibians would be designated with the OA prefix. Most were relatively short-range and slow two-seater aircraft, usually with the ability to take off and land from unprepared fields. The form of the specific planes changes as time and technology progresses through this period, changing along with all the other kinds of planes from wood and fabric to metal construction, water-cooled inline to air-cooled radial engines, and biplane to monoplane airframe structures. Procurement was generally of small batches of a variety of different types of planes, rather than the smaller numbers of types operated concurrently by the other types of tactical units. Some larger twin-engine types, such as the Douglas O-35, were developed for longer-range strategic reconnaissance missions, but these were the exception. Few long-range observation planes existed because, during the early part of the interwar period, this function was to be performed by airships operating as part of the GHQ Air Force. These were part of the lighter-than-air division of the Air Corps, which operated tethered observation balloons and military airships. The U.S. Army was in fact the world's largest operator of military airships between 1921 and 1935, but even so their use could hardly be called large-scale. The airships themselves were of a variety of designs and were produced in very small batches. They ranged from non-rigid blimps to Zeppelin-style semi-rigid designs, and both hydrogen and helium were in use as lifting gases. The U.S. Army's use of airships was for long-range reconnaissance, and the increasing capability of airplanes in this role led to the discontinuation of their use. Only 2 airships were built for the Army after 1930, and their use was officially terminated in 1936. The 5 remaining airships in Army hands at that time were turned over to the Navy, which would from then on be the sole American military operator of these types of machines. By the time the military airship became obsolete in American service, the long-range reconnaissance mission had become primarily a photographic mission. This had become distinct enough from the scouting/artillery spotting/liaison role of observation aviation that it was not included as a mission requirement in observation aircraft, and few long-range observation planes were produced. The photographic reconnaissance mission was afterwards classified as a distinct tactical role by itself in the Air Force scheme. Aircraft specialized for use in this new role were designated with the F prefix, which would be changed to R after the Second World War, when the previous use of the R prefix, that of designating military racing aircraft intended for competition, was discontinued. Army bombardment planes were intended to carry heavy loads of high explosive and drop them on enemy targets far behind their front lines. These targets could either be part of the enemy forces or part of its civilian infrastructure. Bombardment units were intended to use large aircraft with long range and would not be subordinated to any ground commander in the course of their normal employment. Instead, bombardment groups would be kept as an independent striking force under the command of Army GHQ. Opinions differed on the best way to employ the bomber force. An early mission was coastal defense, and bomber crews trained for this mission by practicing long-distance navigation, a skill which would translate very well into their primary mission. It was over the question of this primary mission that the split in opinion came in. Some officers saw the best use of bombers as the direct support of the ground campaign. Though the bombers could fly farther behind the lines, their proper use, this point of view asserted, was to facilitate the operations of the ground army. This could be done by striking airfields, railroads and bridges, supply depots, etc., and could be accomplished by a force of relatively small twin-engine machines with moderate range and payload. The other point of view held that the proper and unique use of the bomber lay in its ability to strike directly at the enemy homeland and the vital industries that supported his war machine. To this end, they advocated the development of large aircraft capable of lifting a multi-ton bomb load to high altitude and delivering it to a target hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. The acquisition of a fleet of such bomber aircraft would be able to end a war by striking the enemy's war potential in his own territory without the need to fight costly battles on land and sea. Though at the time a lot of controversy was generated in the news media around this issue, like most of the inter-service rivalries of this period, it was less a matter of theory than of peacetime funding. Despite the acrimony raised in some quarters over the strategic bombing issue, once the financing became available, the Army was more than happy to develop and use both twin-engine tactical and four-engine strategic bombers in huge quantities. In 1919, the bombardment units were flying DH-4s like most of the rest of the Army's air units. A handful of Caproni and de Havilland O-400s were on hand, the sole fruits of a costly wartime attempt to build an American bomber force. These wartime leftovers would be replaced in 1920 by the first American-designed bomber. A product of the Glenn L. Martin Company, this was known as the MB-2, or more commonly simply as the Martin bomber. Under the new designation system imposed in these years, it became the NBS-1. This was a big wood and wire biplane powered by two Liberty engines. Its top speed was just 99 miles per hour, and it cruised at a little less than this at 90 miles per hour. It could reach a maximum height of just about 8,500 feet, and an economical speed could carry a 1-ton bomb load for about 500 miles. A 4-man crew sat in open positions, and were equipped with 5 30-caliber machine guns to ward off enemy planes. The arrangement of the defensive guns on the NBS-1 would become the standard arrangement employed in interwar bomber designs. This was a pair each in flexible mounts in nose and rear cockpit positions, and a fifth mounted in a rearward-facing amidships position in the belly of the aircraft, fired by a gunner lying in a prone position and covering the angles behind and below the bomber. This was the configuration of the defensive armament for every significant interwar Army bomber until 1935. 130 NBS-1s were produced in the first years of the 20s. Only the first 20 of these were actually built by Martin. The others were built by other aircraft producers in an attempt to spread the very scarce government orders around and thus preserve these companies in business. The Martin bombers would equip all of the Army's bombardment units throughout the 1920s. As these bombers began to show their age, attempts were made to replace them. The first new bombers were little more than modernizations of the design, using metal tube construction and more powerful Curtiss Conqueror engines. This was the Curtiss B-2, known as the Condor. 12 of these planes were acquired in 1929. Performance was a little better than the NBS-1, and defensive firepower was augmented by a 30-caliber machine gun position in the rear of each engine nacelle. A more numerous series of virtually identical bomber types would serve throughout the last years of the 1920s and into the 1930s. These were known as the Keystone bombers, after their Pennsylvania-based manufacturer. The planes themselves were little more than incremental upgrades of the basic twin-engine biplane bomber design laid down by the Martin bomber, and featured little improvement in performance or payload over their predecessors. Various models of these planes would equip the bulk of the U.S. bombardment units until a new generation of bomber aircraft would begin to come into service. This would begin in 1931 with the first flight of the prototype B-9. This is the first American bomber design from Boeing, an aircraft maker that would come to be closely associated with American bombardment aviation. The B-9 was a twin-engine adaptation of that company's single-engine monomail airmail transport plane, and featured a low-wing monoplane airframe built of metal. The structure was fully cantilevered, with no external wires or braces, and the landing gear was semi-retractable. It was powered by a pair of 600-horsepower Pratt & Whitney radials fitted with cowling rings, and these drove the plane to a top speed of 188 miles per hour, a huge improvement over the Keystone machines. In addition, the B-9 could fly much higher than the biplane bombers, but range and payload were not significantly increased. That this design was basically a transitional one can be seen in the lack of trailing edge flaps and the open positions for the crew. Despite its revolutionary nature in some respects, the B-9 was not ordered into series production. This was because of a yet more revolutionary bomber that appeared shortly thereafter. This was the Martin B-10, which first flew in 1933. This bomber brought the potential indicated by the B-9 more fully into realization. Another twin-engine machine, with a 4-man crew, the major production model, the B-10B, was powered by two 770-horsepower two-roll radial engines and could reach almost 215 miles per hour and climb to nearly 25,000 feet. Range was nearly doubled over the biplane bombers, though payload was still in the 1-ton range. The B-10 introduced a number of modern features, such as enclosed crew positions, radio gear, an intercom system, oxygen supply, an advanced bomb sight, as well as a turret for the nose machine gun. 115 B-10s of all varieties were built, and these served as the main equipment of U.S. bombardment squadrons starting with its introduction in 1934. Slightly different models, such as the B-12 and the B-12A, were included in this series, but most often these planes, and the many export versions to be found all over the world, were, like the NBS ones before them, known simply as Martin bombers. The B-10 was superior to anything else in service at the time, and pointed a way towards future bomber development. It was also the last bomber to equip the entire American bombardment force. The B-10s would remain standard equipment until 1936, when a new twin-engine bomber would begin to supersede them in most bombardment squadrons. In U.S. service, none would remain in combat roles by 1941, by which time the aircraft would have been thoroughly obsolete. The same could be said of its replacement, the Douglas B-18. This was a bomber conversion of that company's classic DC-3 airliner in commercial transport. Like that very successful civil aircraft, it was a low-wing twin-engine monoplane, structurally very similar to the DC-3 except for the section forward of the flight deck. Like other militarized versions of airliners, the B-18 was basically unsuitable for the bomber role. Crewed by 6 men and powered by 850 horsepower Wright radials, it was a bit of a step backwards in terms of speed and altitude performance compared to the B-10, but it was capable of carrying a 3-ton bomb load considerably further than any previous U.S. bomber. It began to come into service in 1936, and by 1940 equipped the majority of the U.S. bomber squadrons. This was still the case in 1941, and 33 were stationed in Hawaii at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. Most of these were destroyed in that attack, and the Air Corps B-18s were never committed to combat operations in the Second World War, though some were used for anti-submarine patrols in the Caribbean area. The remainder of the U.S. bombardment units traded their B-10s for a bomber with much more potential, the Boeing B-17. This large 4-engine bomber was developed in pursuance of the strategic bombing policy put forward by U.S. air power advocates. First prototype, Boeing Model 299, made its maiden flight on July 28, 1935, and the aircraft was turned over to the Army for evaluation. In the course of this testing, the prototype crashed on October 30th of that year. This accident, and the high cost of these planes, would delay the development program, and the first production model B-17s would not enter squadron service until nearly 4 years later. The B-17 was far more capable than any bomber that had came before it. Its 4 1,200 horsepower radial engines drove it to speeds approaching 300 miles per hour, and it could climb to nearly 36,000 feet. More importantly, it could carry a 5-ton bomb load more than 2,000 miles. Defensive armament was greatly increased, with early versions mounting 6 machine guns and later models as many as 13. The B-17 was the first version of that war-winning strategic bomber with which the U.S. would attempt to subdue its enemies. Before the entry of the U.S. into the war, and the consequent increase in funding, these very expensive aircraft were built in small batches only, and at the outbreak of the war they equipped a small proportion of the bombardment formations only. The B-18 and especially the B-17 were in a different class altogether than the wooden biplane bombers the U.S. was using at the beginning of the 20s. From the ideas represented by their pre-war conception and use would stem the large forces of medium and heavy bombers the Army would field in the coming conflict. The mission of the Army's pursuit units was straightforward: to fight enemy aircraft in the air. This could be done in an offensive role by intercepting attacking aircraft, or as part of an offensive mission in the form of an escort of attack or bombardment planes. Like Army attack aviation units, the pursuit formations were normally placed under the operational control of ground force commanders at the field Army level. However, according to contemporary doctrine, a proportion of pursuit squadrons is always retained for use as part of the independent GHQ Air Force. The pursuit squadrons of the air service were unique in the immediate post-war years in that they did not use the DH-4. Other World War I types were in standard use, mainly British SE-5As and French SPAD-13s. This wartime equipment was superseded in 1922 by a new Boeing design, the MB-3A. This aircraft was handicapped by engine troubles during its 2 years as first-line equipment and was replaced by the Curtiss PW-8 beginning in 1924. This was the water-cooled predecessor to the Curtiss Hawk series of biplane fighters that were then to equip the pursuit formations throughout the 1920s. The first models, designated P-1s, reached squadrons in 1925. This initial model of the Hawk was a wooden fabric biplane powered by a 435 horsepower Curtiss D-12. It had a top speed of just 163 miles per hour and a range of about 400 miles. Like all the major American fighter types until the mid-1930s, The Hawk was armed with a pair of rifle-caliber machine guns firing ahead through the propeller disc. In the age of biplane fighters, the decisive factor was maneuverability and the ability to prevail in a dogfight. The Hawks, in consequence, were very agile aircraft. The fact that agility was favored over speed at this time is indicated by the improved Model P5 Hawk, which was almost 20 miles per hour slower than the P1. This would change with the last major model of the Hawk, the P6, which received a power upgrade in the form of a 600 horsepower engine. This pushed the plane's speed up to almost 200 miles per hour and greatly improved its rate of climb. In 1932, the aircraft that was to be the Army's first step towards the new paradigm of military aircraft design had its maiden flight. This was another Boeing fighter, P-26. The first of these new planes reached operational squadrons in March of 1933, and thus, in the deployment of this new generation of fighter aircraft, the Americans led the great military powers, as they would do 2 years later in the field of modern bomber design with the B-10. Like the B-9, the P-26 was a transitional type, with fixed, spatted undercarriage and an open cockpit, as well as a small amount of external wire bracing. In terms of performance, it was a decisive step forward from the Hawk biplanes, with a top speed nearly 40 miles an hour faster and a better climb rate. Though armament was still limited to a pair of machine guns, one or both of these were the heavier 50 caliber variety. Almost exactly 2 years later, the Russians would field a fighter very similar to the P-26, the Polikarpov I-16. The P-26 was the better known of the two, and in reporting on the Civil War in Spain, Russian fighters involved in the fighting were often misidentified as Boeings. This led to the widespread impression that the Americans were supplying aircraft and other weapons to the Republican forces in Spain. All the P-26s built were part of a single order placed in January 1933 for 136 planes. This was the largest contract for aircraft placed by the Army since 1921. The P-26s would serve as first-line equipment from late 1933 until 1938, when they would be replaced in service by a pair of aircraft that would be the direct predecessors to a generation of fighters that the Americans would be using when they became involved in the Second World War. These were the Seversky P-35 and the Curtiss P-36. One look at these planes tell the experienced eye that from them were derived respectively the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-40 Warhawk. Both were thoroughly up-to-date radial engine monoplanes with enclosed cockpits and retractable landing gear, as well as radio and most of the other accessories one would expect to find on a Second World War aircraft. The P-36 was the faster of the two, topping out at 325 miles per hour in some of its later models, but the P-35 was the better armed, being the first American pursuit ship to carry an armament of 4 machine guns. Aircraft such as the P-35 and P-36 represented a relatively straightforward application of advancing technology to the conventional idea of the pursuit ship. Because of this, though they may have been revolutionary in terms of performance and capability over their predecessors, they soon came to define the new idea of conventionality in regard to fighters. However, no one really knew what to expect out of the new kinds of combat implied by the new capabilities of aircraft. 2 other planes built by the Air Corps in this period show less conventional approaches to the possibilities of air battle in the coming years. One of these was the P-30, or as it was designated under the older system, the PB-2. PB in this case stands for Pursuit Biplace, as this was a 2-man single-engine fighter with a pilot and gunner sitting in tandem. It was of modern low-wing design and featured most of the advanced features of the P-36 and 35. The idea of the 2-man fighter, where the second man could navigate or operate radio gear, and perhaps prove invaluable as a gunner, was one that led most of the air forces of this period to produce one or more such aircraft. 2-man fighters had been valuable in the Great War, and it was thought that planes such as this could be valuable either as bomber destroyers or bomber escorts, but experience in the Second World War soon revealed these kinds of fighters, especially the single-engine types such as this one, or the wartime Blackburn Skua and Fairey Fulmar, to be at a severe disadvantage against their single-seat counterparts. The other was a much more daring design, which seems to have owed something to the outlandish GA-1 cannon arm attack triplane. This was the Bell Aracuda, designated the FM-1, and it first flew in 1937. This is a big 5-man machine powered by 2 1150 horsepower V12 engines in a pusher configuration. The plane was very large for a fighter, larger than most contemporary bombers, and both of the engine nacelles featured a manned gun position forward of the engine compartment mounting a 37mm cannon. The cannon were aimed by a mechanical sighting device by a gunner seated in the fuselage, and the gunners in the nacelle positions mostly acted as loaders while this principal gunner fired the weapons. This was a very advanced concept for a dedicated bomber destroyer, and with a top speed of almost 275 miles per hour, this big plane would have been very dangerous to bomber formations in 1937, probably much more so than the P-35s and 36s. The advancement in technology made the concept obsolescent by the time service trial machines were delivered in 1939, and the idea was not proceeded with. Some of the idea behind the era CUDA was reflected in the much more successful P-38 Lightning twin-engine interceptor. These 4 aircraft represent the last interwar pursuit planes used by the U.S. Army. They're successors of the next generation, the Curtiss P-40 and the Bell P-39, would in fact appear before the war, but belong more properly to the story of the wartime Army Air Force, which is a topic for another episode. And with that, I'm going to end this episode. I hope you found some of this interesting or useful, and I hope that I've been able to give you a pretty good representative picture of the kind of thing that was going on in U.S. aviation during this period. Next time I talk to you about the United States military, I'm going to be focusing on a less known aspect of their activity in the period around the end of the First World War. This is the participation of American forces in the Allied intervention in the Civil War that followed the fall of the Tsar and the emergence of the Soviet regime. So I hope you join me for that, and for the next episode, when we'll turn back to Spain and take a look at the last years of the Republic and the uprising and consequent split of that country into warring factions. With that said, I'd like to thank you once again for listening, and I'll be wishing you all the best until next time.